Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. I hope you guys are all having a wonderful Saturday. Today I want to talk to you about something that is extremely important when it comes to breeding reptiles and really just in business in general, and that is margin. The reason I'm making this video is I feel like it's a common misconception and something I hear quite often, especially lately. Things like, well, if you've sold a gecko for $100, you just made $100. Or let's say you started a project that was $10,000, people will say things like, well, you just need to sell 10 $1,000 geckos and then you've made your money back. And that is completely false, and I wanted to explain to you why that is in case you're someone who believes this, and what you can actually do to calculate how much you would need to sell to make your money back, and just some other general things on why it's extremely important to understand this. If I had to explain margin in one sentence, it's basically just what you've made total versus what you actually get to keep. So think of, let's pretend you work a job without overtime, right? Overtime doesn't exist. And you make $10 an hour, let's say, and you work for 10 hours. So you've made 10 times 10, you made $100, right? Which is true, you've made $100, but you check your paycheck and you'll see that there's only $80 on it. Why is that? Well, there was taxes in this case, and so you lost probably about 20% of your paycheck. So even though you've technically made $100, you only get to keep 80. And that's just in an employee scenario where there's no business expenses and all the rest of it, right? So just imagine what happens if you're running your own small business or even just as a hobby. You should really understand this too. And if you're not getting into business, if you can understand this before you start, you'll be miles ahead of people who don't even understand it and are already doing business. So step one, before we even get into the scenarios, is that if you're not even tracking your numbers, meaning what you're selling, how much it's selling for, all your expenses, food, care, lighting, heating, you really need to do that first, because if you don't understand that and you can't even look at your numbers, you can't calculate what your margin is and what you actually get to keep. And you really need to have everything. If you're just doing like what you've sold, how much food costs, and that's about it, that doesn't give you a full picture either, because there's so many other things that go into it. So if you can really get it down to a T, start tracking all the stuff that you've sold, all the expenses you've had, and all of that kind of stuff, then you can really calculate it. And if you have all that, you can really do this in like 30 seconds after watching this video. But now let's get into some scenarios in case you're not a breeder, or maybe you are a breeder and you're not tracking it. This is probably what you could expect. So let's do scenario number one here. You're a small breeder and in a single year you've sold $10,000 worth of geckos. Pretty good, right? Now let's just pretend that in that year that you sold $10,000 worth, you sold 20 animals, right? So if you sold 20 animals, you probably have about 50, including that 20. So you have 30 left over. And we're just going over a year's span, right, to make it easy. But you probably have, some grow outs, some extra animals that you're thinking about keeping, but maybe you'll sell, other little babies you didn't sell yet, breeders, all that kind of stuff. So let's just say you have 50 geckos and 20 of them you sold for 10,000, right? So the first thing that's going to come off to calculate our gross margin is going to be shipping cost. And if you sold 20, let's just pretend that you sold them to all different people. And I know for me, I've calculated it out. It costs about $70 for shipping. So that's the actual price of the label, and then the price of the box, the cryo pack, the packing material, the packing slip itself, the deli cup, the packing paper, the stickers I put in the box, etc. Everything that goes into that is actually about $12, but we're just going to say it's 10. So it costs me $60 for the label usually, and then about $10 for the stuff. So in this case, you sold 20 of them for $70 shipping. You're going to have to pay about $1,400 worth of shipping. And then the next thing would be the fees. If you're using a traditional processor like PayPal or Stripe, or any type of credit card, any platform that takes a fee, I just generalized and said that they usually take about 3%, give or take. And so that would be $300 on that 10,000 that you sold. So now you're down to $8,300. 1,400 plus 300 minus 10,000. And this is the money that now you would use to pay all of your expenses. So that's going to be your food, your crickets, your website, your MorphMarket, your decor, cage supplies, lighting, heating, building costs if you have any, marketing, vending show fees, other MISC fees, going to the vet, employees, etc. The list goes on and on and on and on, right? I could go on all day probably about different things that you could, take away. And this is not financial advice either. This is just me letting you know things that should be coming out of this, right? So I didn't go into all of them. I just did the big three that I thought of. So it would be food, crickets, and your website MorphMarket at this size. So a long time ago, I figured out it costs about $7.50 a year to feed a crested gecko for an entire year. So, and that was before the, Pangea raised their prices. I don't know if Repashi's raised theirs, but I just went off of that. So $7.50 times 50 geckos is $375 a year in food. Crickets, I thought that you could buy them online at this size. If you're buying from a pet store, you can probably double this number. But online, you can get crickets for about 2 to 3 cents each, and even sometimes cheaper depending on how many you buy, although you don't need that many at this size. So I feed crickets once a week, and I give them usually 3 to 4, and I just figured for 4 once a week, it's going to cost you about $312 a year in crickets if you buy them online. And then I figured for a website plus MorphMarket, it's about $750. I know for me it's actually more, but you could probably cheap out on this a little bit and get it down a little ways. Now, other expenses, like I had mentioned, decor, cage supplies, lighting, heating, marketing, blah, 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 right? I just said $500 and that kind of stuff. Really depends, if you have to go to the vet, you might be way up there already, but if you don't, you're probably a little bit cheaper. It's hard to say, but just as a generalization, $500 for that. So now you subtract that from your $8,300 and you're left with $6,363. So that's great. Now you have 63% of your total $10,000, which is still good. I know that doesn't sound like much, but in the general business world, that's pretty good. Unfortunately, you still forgot about one thing that you have to pay. Now that all your expenses are deducted from that, you're still going to have to pay taxes on that. And this is hard to say depending on your income level, if this is your full-time job, if you're just doing this on the side. But just to make it simple across the board, I did 20% again. And so you just take that, you times it by 0.8. So you're going to get $5,090. So if we just say $5,000 to be easy, you're getting to keep $5,000 on every $10,000 you make in this scenario, or 50%. And that would be your profit. Your net profit left over is 50% of whatever you sold. Now, it doesn't always scale this way if you get bigger. Some of your expenses are fixed and they're not going to grow as you grow. For example, food is not a fixed expense. The more geckos you get, the more food you'll have to buy. But your website is. Your website's not going to get more expensive whether you have 10 geckos or 1,000 geckos, right? So this kind of doesn't scale, and as you get bigger, you can keep more and more of the money you make, although it gets exponentially harder the farther you go up. So just keep that in mind as well. But on this case, you sold 10,000, you made 5,000. So you got 50% back. So that was using a small breeder. You're roughly running a 50% net margin, meaning you're keeping 50% of whatever you make, which is really good actually, just in the general scope of things. But I wanted to do a full-time breeder next just to see where they could be at. I did the same thing using the same costs. I said they sold $70,000 worth of geckos in a year, and they sold 100 geckos. So that means that their average price was a little bit higher at $700, meaning that they sold some that were well over $700, and they sold some that were cheaper than $700. But they sold 100 geckos total, and using that same ratio, they would have about 250 geckos at any given time, including the 100 that they sold. So $7,000 in shipping fees, assuming they all went to different places. Again, 70 times 100 is 7,000, so you can take that right off the top. I did not include any geckos that they had purchased that they sold. I'm assuming that they bred all the geckos. All of those 100 were bred in-house and they produced. Next up, if you went through traditional payment processors, it's about $2,100 in fees again. Food, using the same ratio, $1,875. Crickets, $1,560. Website and MorphMarket, if you're selling this volume, you're probably going to have a little bit more expensive MorphMarket plan. So I bumped you up to $1,000 a year between your website and MorphMarket. And then lighting, heating, misc fees, all the other stuff I mentioned before. At this size, now you have 5 times as many geckos as that small breeder. So I said $2,000 a year, even though it should be $2,500. It's probably a little bit cheaper, so that's why I did $2,000, and that leaves you with $54,465 after all your expenses were deducted, which is pretty good. Unfortunately, again, you got to pay taxes, probably about 20%, give or take. So now you're down to $43,572, and all that you have to do to calculate your margin is you take that number and you divide it by what you sold total. So 43,572 divided by 70,000, that's going to give you 0.622, which is a 62% profit on that, which is really good. And so just by going off of this, we can guess that most people are in between, I would say, On the low end, you're probably around 30 to 40%, probably closer to 40. And if you're really good and you're really doing well, you're probably closer to 80%. And so this is kind of a big range, I know, but it really depends on a lot of factors. The biggest factors that I could see that would really heavily influence this is if you're selling geckos that you had to pay for, meaning that you didn't produce them, because that really takes a big chunk out of what you get to keep, right? So for example, if you sold a gecko that was $400 and you paid $200 for it, your ratio is going to be a lot smaller than the ones we just looked at. The other one would be it takes the same amount of food, crickets, lighting, heating, etc. to produce a gecko that's $1,000 versus $100. And so if you sell 100 geckos that are $100 versus 10 that are $1,000, your ratio is going to be way different, right? So it really depends on how many geckos you're selling and what price you're selling them at, plus if you're selling them that you produced or that you had to pay for. Those are the two main things that are really going to shift this, but you can just figure in general between 40 and 80%. I would say most people are probably going to fall between 50 and 65%, give or take, maybe a little bit higher, a little bit lower. But now let's kind of circle back to the initial story that I brought up, where someone said that if you have $10,000 project, you just need to sell $10,000 worth of geckos to break even. And now, assuming that you didn't sell the initial geckos that you bought, you would need to actually sell, if we use the ratio from our professional breeder here, that you would actually need to sell about $16,150 worth of geckos to break even on a $10,000 project if you were running that 62% margin, net margin. Because keep in mind, you had to take money that was in your pocket out of it and go buy those animals. So you had to spend that money. You had to spend the $10,000, right? Now, to get that money back, you would need to actually make $16,000 from that project just to break even, right? And assuming you didn't sell the geckos that you had paid for, you wanted to keep them and make the money back, that's how much you would need to do. And if we use the ratio from our small breeder, which was 50%, you would need to sell $20,000 worth of geckos to get that money back. And the nice thing is that once you start understanding this a little bit more, you can say, okay, well, like for example, last year, if you had bought two Axanthics for $20,000, again, at that 60%-ish range, you would say, okay, well, I know that to make my money back on this project, I really need to sell about $33,000 worth of geckos, give or take, and then I'll have made my money back from this without selling the animals, and then anything after that is just profit. And I think this is important to consider, considering that a lot of geckos are very expensive, and sometimes breeding projects can take years, and so you can kind of gauge, well, is it going to really take like 3 years to just break even on this project? Am I planning to work with it that long, etc., etc.? And so I think this really goes a long way. I think if you can understand this, it's going to give you a better idea of maybe projects you should start, projects you shouldn't start. But I hope this was helpful to you, and I hope it gives you a little bit of a better idea of your finances. With that being said, thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in my next one.